I haven't been married to a military historian for nearly 50 years without learning to recognize military potential when it's shoved in my face. The defensive aspects of this castle are obvious. Inside, however, is a culturally significant and lovely set of buildings that have played a huge role in the development of modern Scotland. Stirling Castle sits on top of a huge dolomite rock. It overlooks the River Forth. Three sides face out over cliffs, making it impregnable from that side. No enemies could have gotten up those cliffs without the defenders seeing them. The fourth side, which has been heavily fortified, leads steeply downhill to a modern castle town. Let's take a look at this fascinating example of Scottish architecture and the history behind it here on the Armchair Traveler.
Welcome to my channel. If you think this content is interesting or useful, please like, share, and subscribe. This will help the channel grow. Travel content often involves a lot of history, and history can be really word heavy enough that the details often don't make it into a video blog. If you care to dig deeper, you can visit my regular blog on WordPress, where you'll find deep dives, travel tips, reviews, warnings, and the nuts and bolts on how to travel safely and conveniently. If you'd like to keep up with my posts, you can follow me on Twitter. The addresses are on your screen and in the description box below.
I visited Stirling Castle on a gorgeous sunny Sunday. The downside was that, surprisingly, the trolley buses meant to haul visitors up to the site from the train station weren't running very frequently, so I ended up hiking uphill from the train station. It was such a pretty day that I didn't mind that much. One thing I noticed as I was passing was the Church of the Holy Rood. This was a medieval parish church. It is named after the Holy Rood, which is a relic of the true cross on which Jesus was crucified. The original building, now long gone, dated from 1129. The present building dates from the 15th century. The photo on the right, which is not mine, shows the church as seen from the castle. I noticed this badly weathered headstone in the graveyard of the Holy Rood. It shows a devil snatching the body, although I can't tell whether it's a child or an adult. Either way, I cannot imagine how a parent would have commissioned and paid for something like this. Stirling Castle was first mentioned in print around 1110 AD, and many royal dramas have unfolded here. The castle was cited mostly because of its physical isolation, which should have protected it from capture, especially considering how heavily fortified it was with those stone walls, but it didn't work. The castle grounds are divided into three sections. The largest of these, which looks a little like a snout in this drawing, was called the Nether Green and the Nether Bailey. There were walls here along with cannon, and soldiers were stationed to look out over both sides of the cliff and the valley. Nether here just means lower, in that it sat a little lower than the residential complex. The residential complex inhabited area included the Old Palace, the New Palace, the chapel, Great Hall, treasury, and kitchen, all surrounding an inner courtyard in the center. The area toward the right of the image shows the defensive area called a counterguard. This was built with two separate walls. The older of these, the inner wall, came complete with towers, a drawbridge, a portcullis, and a gate. To capture the castle, a besieger would need to get over all of that. Some years later, it was deemed insufficiently strong, and a second wall with a second portcullis and gate were added. The only reasonable way into this castle would be coming in from the city entrance up that hill. What did this castle not have? There's no keep or donjon, as the French call it. This was an earlier development, and many castles I visited do, or at least did, have them. It was the last resort, initially, into which the castle garrison might retreat. It was also typically the first building constructed when a castle was thrown up on a hill. Neither Stirling nor Edinburgh Castle featured them. By the time they were developed, castle design had advanced and relied more on walls, ditches, artillery, and moats for defense. If an attacker got past all of that, the odds that they couldn't make it into the keep eventually were pretty slim, and a keep wasn't a very comfortable place for the family or his lord to live. On the left is the William Wallace Memorial, seen in the far distance from Stirling Castle. In the center is a stained glass memorial to Wallace at Edinburgh Castle. Right is a memorial to Robert the Bruce, just outside of Stirling Castle. Every country and people has a foundation myth. Sometimes they're just fairy tales, other times they're based on real people, and most of the time the story is somewhere in the middle. William Wallace and Robert the Bruce are each part of the Scottish foundation tale. They were real people, but their stories are at considerable variance to one another. Wallace was basically a guerrilla leader with no real status in Scottish society before he picked up arms against the English. Robert the Bruce was a king, a warrior king who descended from a long royal family. A little background here should help you understand. England and Scotland were once completely separate countries. Different origin for the people, different languages, different points of view. The Scots wanted to control with one king from their side. The English wanted the same thing. The Scottish Wars of Independence dragged on for generations. They were a series of military campaigns fought between the Kingdom of Scotland and the Kingdom of England in the late 13th, early 14th centuries. During these wars, and I would argue it was really just one continuous war with long truces, the kings of England repeatedly sought to extend their rule north of the border into Scotland. The kings of Scotland tried the same thing, moving south. The Scots objected. The squabbling started long before the first open fighting and continued for what must have seen an endless time. The First War, if you want to count it that way, lasted 32 years, starting with an English invasion of Scotland in 1296 and ended with the signing of the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328. The two characters in the foundation myth that we'll talk about are William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. The story of William Wallace, who's the same man rather romantically portrayed in the movie Braveheart, goes that he murdered a local sheriff who had apparently murdered Wallace's sweetheart. English law was after him for that murder. Rather than running, he raised a band of Scots and attacked in the name of Scottish independence. He won a huge battle in September 1298 at Stirling Bridge, which is just below the castle. The following month, the Scots raided northern England. This turned out to be a huge mistake. English forces under Edward I demolished the Scots at the Battle of Falkirk. Wallace survived the second battle, but spent most of the next 7 years hiding out in the woods. Eventually, someone ratted him out. He was captured, dragged off to London, then tied, convicted, hung, drawn, and quartered. His head was spiked on London Bridge, and fragments of his body were distributed among several Scottish cities as a grim reminder of the price of revolt. As far as I can tell, Edward's daughter-in-law, the young and ferocious Isabella of France, sometimes called the she-wolf of France, who was credited in the movie not just with slipping Wallace some kind of drug, but possibly being impregnated by him in favor of her generally inept husband, never laid eyes on Wallace. Also, the Scots didn't start wearing kilts for several hundred years after these events took place. Movies dramatize. Robert the Bruce was probably the most famous of the Scottish warriors of his generation. Unlike William Wallace, who was at best a guerrilla warrior, Robert was a hereditary king of Scotland who could trace his legitimate claim to the throne backwards to the very first king of Scotland, and his bloodline proceeded forward all the way to James VI. Robert kept his crown not only by fighting, but also through shrewd political maneuvering. His most famous battle was probably at Bannockburn, which you can see in the image on the left, taken from the Scottish National Gallery in Edinburgh. In it, he defeated the English and forced them to agree to full Scottish independence in the 1328 Treaty of Northampton, in which the English king recognized Scotland as an independent country and Robert the Bruce and his heirs as the legitimate royal family. He led a complicated life in an age when even knowing who was in charge, much less who to believe, was difficult. However, we do know he is celebrated as Good King Robert. He was a real person. The residential and other buildings we see inside the castle today date from the late 14th and early 15th century. This wall and gateway are quite a bit older. The townward side of the castle, as I mentioned earlier, was the only feasible approach for an aggressor. It was always heavily fortified with walls, towers. They're now apparently only about half of their original heights, and a fortified gateway facing a drawbridge over a moat, complete with a portcullis. A portcullis always looks to me like a giant pitchfork ready to slam down and not only close the opening, but stab anyone who was unlucky enough to be in its path to death. The walkway you see here is solid. The drawbridge is long gone. There was a drawbridge here until 1714. Stirling Castle's first defense was its nearly inaccessible location, although there was a major exception to that on the townward side of the castle grounds. Still, no large group was going to be able to scale those cliffs. That didn't mean the defenders could afford to leave the remainder of the site unwatched or unprotected. Among other things, they might want to shoot people they saw in the valley. Medieval castles were designed to be as defensible as possible, with every feature developed as part of the defense. On the right, you can see a view of some of the walls, complete with the steps for the defenders to climb on around the nether bailey. The cannons on the left still stand defense for the castle. The opening in the wall was an arrow slit. As warfare progressed with the development of new weapons or a new threat was identified, castles were sometimes modified, although later on they were just abandoned. In the early 1700s, Anne Stuart was on the throne. Anne was the second daughter of James VII. In a complicated religious system at the time, James had been a Catholic. His supporters were called Jacobites. Anne was a Protestant. There were several uprisings, and Queen Anne and her advisors saw fit to strengthen the defenses of the castle. They added this secondary outer wall, gate, and portcullis, and that's the most visible parts of the effort. This addition meant there were two defensive walls with a kind of open killing ground in between. This was the first Renaissance-style palace built in Scotland. It boasted both French and other architectural influences. James IV saw himself as a Renaissance man in the same mold as Henry VIII of England or Francis of France. All three were in touch with current events, had relations with the outside world, and knew the culture not only of their own kingdoms but of the wider world. Each was well educated, musical, spoke several languages, and perhaps most importantly, married for dynastic reasons to women from outside the realm. When you visit a castle, whether it's fully decorated, partially decorated like this one, or just ruins, it can be difficult to remember that once upon a time, real people had to live here. Even the bleakest, coldest, and grimmest of them had features and fixtures designed to make them seem more livable. Almost all, after the 14th century, had tapestries. The reason there weren't tapestries earlier is because the skill only developed in 14th century France. These served not only to beautify the rooms, but to insulate them. Rushes, probably not cleaned out nearly often enough, were piled on the stone floors to make them seem softer and again to insulate from the cold. The gardens you see here were just one more effort at making the place seem more inhabitable. James IV, to whom we were introduced during the Scottish Wars of Independence, turned out to be one of the most successful of the Stuart kings of Scotland. He was a Renaissance man, interested in and in tune with the art, culture, science, and literature of his time. Among other things, he imported the first printing press into Scotland. He's generally regarded as the most successful of the Stuart monarchs of Scotland. He was responsible for building what is now called the King's Old Building. It's now a military museum, along with the Great Hall, the kitchen, and rebuilding the Royal Chapel. He was also extremely practical. He signed a treaty of perpetual peace with Henry VII, the first in the Tudor line, and married Henry's older daughter to seal the deal. But the peace only lasted until 1513. The center painting you see here of the wedding of James IV and Mary Tudor is one in a series of romanticized murals in the Scottish National Gallery in Edinburgh. James's reign ended in a disastrous defeat at the Battle of Flodden, where he became the last monarch not only from Scotland, but all of Great Britain to actually die in battle. James saw himself not just as the equal of his fellow princes on the continent, but may well have seen himself as superior to the Tudors. James's family had been hereditary kings of Scotland basically forever, with a couple of intermissions, dating all the way back to before Robert the Bruce. Henry VII, the Tudor of England, was the first in his line to sit on the throne, which he had taken by force. To say that Henry's grasp and legitimacy to the title were tenuous would be understating it. Henry needed alliances with more established families, of which the Stuarts were the closest. Mountaintops, even when substantially weathered, often have surprisingly little flat ground. Stirling Castle sits on top of a magma outcropping, which hardly weathered at all. An enormous amount of labor must have gone into developing or enlarging this relatively flat space. Here you can see on the left the King's Old Building, which was the initial palace of James IV. It was literally built out to the cliff face, maximizing the space in the central area, which is called the Close. The building on the right was the chapel. The King's House, which is now sometimes called the King's Old Building, was built expressly for James IV about 1496. Its far end is located on the highest part of the castle rock. It is likely that the site had been built on before, probably several times earlier in the history of the castle. This building was solely residential and never meant to withstand an invading force. Today, the King's Old Building houses the Regimental Museum of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. On the left here, you see a memorial to the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, this time from the South African Wars of 1899 to 1902. The two images in the center on the right are stained glass from inside the museum and a copy of a recruiting poster. Today, the King's Old Building houses the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders Regimental Museum. I remember in about the 6th grade, as part of English class, I was forced to memorize at least part of Alfred Lord Tennyson's famous poem about the Battle of Balaclava, The Charge of the Light Brigade. You might have done the same. Into the Valley of Death rode the 500. The Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders participated in that battle. This painting is called The Thin Red Line by Robert Gibb. The Thin Red Line described an episode in the Battle of Balaclava some 30 years before it was painted and during the Crimean War. In the incident, about 500 men of the 93rd Sutherland Highlanders, led by Sir Colin Campbell, aided by a small force of 100 walking wounded, 40 detached guardsmen, and supported by a substantial force of Turkish infantrymen, formed a line of fire against the Russian cavalry. Previously, Campbell's Highland Brigade had taken part in actions at the Battle of Alma and the Battle of Sevastopol. Incidentally, each of those battles has a Paris metro station named after them. There were more Victoria Crosses presented to the Highland Southerners at that time than at any other. The term, the Thin Red Line, refers to the Highlanders' job to defend the British Empire and the United Kingdom. Rudyard Kipling also wrote a poem called Tommy, which I think describes this scene. Then it's Tommy this and Tommy that and Tommy how's your soul, but it's the thin red line of heroes when the drums begin to roll. On the left, you can see a view of the Great Hall. The figures in the foreground give you an idea of just how large this structure was. Work began here under James IV, although he didn't live long enough to see it completed. Still, he and his family needed and wanted a place to display their wealth and position to the rest of the world. One feature here was the immense timbered ceiling. Some of the oak timbers themselves were decorated with carvings, as you can see in the top right. Carvings will play an important role in the most famous feature of the castle, the Stirling heads. Those sad curtains visible on the left and just above the fireplace, where I would never put anything even remotely combustible, are meant to represent what were probably extravagant tapestries, placed here mostly as insulation as well as for decoration. The massive fireplace shown here was both a blessing and probably a curse. Fire was one way in which these buildings were destroyed. It's difficult to see in this photo, but there's a massive iron fireback at the back side of the fireplace, which would have reflected at least some of the heat back into the room. You knew somehow King Arthur was going to sneak into this story. Tradition suggests that King Arthur might have hung out here at Stirling Castle. Of course, tradition also gives us Arthur sightings pretty much all over, including one alleged burial ground all the way in Sicily on Mount Etna, and all over modern Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I wouldn't be a bit surprised to find out one day there's a burial site on Mars. We can actually make some intelligent guesses about the real Arthur if he ever existed in the form of one man. More than likely, however, the person that we think of as King Arthur, celebrated on stage and screen, was an amalgamation of several. I suspect there probably was a real person or several real people behind the story. We can guess that Arthur most likely was a Romanized Briton and probably a soldier who remained behind when the Britons bugged out of the islands in the 5th century A.D. Emperor Constantine III gets fingered as the hitman on this one, but Roman military strength had been eroding for generations. Rome itself was under attack, and the government needed those soldiers to defend the city. From the 5th century to the 13th, when this castle was first built, was a very long time. Still, it seems to me that such a lovely, defensible site almost certainly hosted humans long before they threw up castle walls. Medieval kings and chroniclers clearly believed the same thing. And I suppose anything is possible, but the timeline doesn't match up very well. Still, the name and association with Arthur is a huge tourist and financial draw. I recall some romantics on TV doing archaeological excavation here looking for evidence. The only way they could finance it wasn't looking for evidence about how the castle was built, but looking for evidence about King Arthur, so that's how they pitched it on TV. They found a lot of things, but no King Arthur. There is one oddity that they fastened onto. If you look down from the castle grounds, as I show you in the photo, you can see a raised tableland. Unfortunately, there's no human standing there to give you the scale, but there's some cars in the background that show you that it was raised up a substantial amount. The Romantics claimed that this somehow must have been King Arthur's round table. If it was, Arthur and his men had to have been giants. Historical records tell us that this was something called the King's and Queen's Knots, which were part of some gardens located below the castle and only date from the 1100s AD. Aside from the military and marauding invaders and possibly insects, the greatest danger to medieval palaces was probably fire. When James IV built his great new hall here, which rivaled in terms of size and splendor of all others in the islands, he wanted to try to make sure that some careless cook couldn't accidentally burn it to the ground. As a result, the building had a separate kitchen, shown here. We know from watching what happened to Notre Dame de Paris how even a well-seasoned oak timber frame roof can go up in smoke. The fact is, wood burns. The builders did what they could to isolate the possible trouble from the rest of the grounds. A separate building, sturdy thick walls, small windows. The small windows meant poor ventilation and very little light for the people who had to work in there, but after all, that was just ordinary people who'd suffer working there and be happy to get paid, not the royal family. Now it's time to end the first part of our tour, since the kitchen reminds me it might be time for lunch and take a break for some much-needed refreshment. It pays to look at reviews before you leave home. Google Maps is your new best friend, to make sure something reasonably good and reasonably priced will be available at a reasonable distance from whatever place you're visiting. As so often happens, whoever manages to get the concession at a historic site has a kind of lock on it until the contract is over, and there is nothing that the site can do if the restaurant doesn't measure up. I took a look at what was available and wasn't buying, although I remember the reviews at the time weren't that bad. I brought along a sandwich and bought a drink at the cafe inside the palace grounds, since I knew there was no way on earth I was going to traipse down that hill any distance and then come back up. A look at Google Maps shows me the cafe I visited is long gone, replaced by a restaurant with terrible reviews. It pays to check ahead. I hope you enjoyed your walk through the first half of Stirling Castle. Join me next time for part 2, where we'll focus on James V's luxurious palace, the tapestry, and the famous Stirling heads, here on the Armchair Traveler.